So it all started one morning after a night of fishing and catching no fish. Peter and his partners were bone tired, washing their nets along the shore. You're familiar with this story by now. A traveling preacher interrupted their routine and asked Peter to row out a little way so he could talk to the crowd pressing in on him, and Peter obliged. But just when they had finished washing their nets and were ready to go home, hoping to go home, the preacher asked them to go out and try fishing again, and they objected, but they did it anyway, and this time so many fish jumped into their nets, their boats began to sink, and Peter cried out, "Get away from me, I'm not worthy of this." And Jesus just said, "Peter, get over yourself and come follow me." And he did. Immediately, he dropped everything. So for the past 3 months, we have been following the story of Peter, and we know of his extraordinary highs, like walking on water, and his exceptional lows, like when he realized he was walking on water and began to sink. His extraordinary highs, like when he recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, and his exceptional lows, like when he completely misunderstood what that meant. Jesus as Messiah was not someone who would come in and exact retribution on their enemies, but someone who would save the world by his sacrificial love. And when he heard Jesus talk of his impending suffering and death, Peter scolded him and said, "Never." Jesus called Peter Satan. How's that for an exceptional low? Don't you understand? God would redeem the world. God would redeem the hatred and cruelty of the violent Romans through the example of love, Christ's love. So we've heard these stories and many more. Like when Jesus was being dragged away by soldiers, Peter demanded 3 times, "I don't know that man." But after his resurrection, while preparing some breakfast on the beach, Jesus gave Peter the opportunity to redeem himself with 3 questions. Do you love me? You know the second question? How about the third? Do you love me? So it was 40 days after that, Peter and the rest of them watched as Jesus ascended into heaven, and now with Jesus gone, it was time to get busy. So at their first organizational meeting, Peter stood up in front of 120 followers and laid out criteria to select a 12th apostle to replace Judas, and completely overlooked Mary Magdalene as the obvious choice. But no one seemed to question Peter in the role of leader. But of course, he was the first of Jesus' disciples that morning after they'd fished all night and caught no fish. Peter, impetuous, hot-headed, but he seemed to mature after Jesus departed. Or at least stories about him began to focus more on his accomplishments than his failings. Peter helped to establish the new church as a community in which no one had need for anything, because those with means sold properties to support the community. Peter traveled preaching and teaching and inviting people to change their hearts and lives, but one day was confronted with an existential dilemma. Could someone who wasn't Jewish be baptized too? So 2 weeks ago, we heard a great story about how through dreams and visions, Peter was convinced that Gentiles were as much a part of the circle of Christ as anyone. And word got back to some angry skeptics in Jerusalem that Peter had baptized non-Jews, but Peter stood up to them, and the church forever changed. The intent of the church, if not always its reality, is an inclusive body that welcomes all, and we can thank Peter for that. But finally, now today, we have come to the conclusion of his story. It begins with King Herod harassing people who belong to the church, harassing and killing. And it may sound awful, but the general population loved it. So Herod decided to give them some more to cheer about and had Peter arrested and put in prison. 16 soldiers were assigned to guard him. As he lay sleeping on the ground, 2 were chained to him, while the others guarded the entrances. And while he was asleep, as you heard, an angel appeared. The angel nudged him awake and said, "Quick, get up." And the chains attached to the guards on both sides fell from his wrists. Peter got dressed, followed the angel, and they passed through one gate, where were the guards, and then through a second gate. And when they came to the final gate to the city, the iron doors opened themselves, and they ran down the length of the street, and then the angel disappeared. And Peter thought he was having a dream, but standing outside there by himself, he realized this was all happening. And he also realized any minute now a search party would be out looking for him. Can you imagine Herod's rage at the incompetence of 16 guards, 2 of them chained to him, Peter being held behind 3 locked gates? And yes, in fact, Herod was enraged. In the morning, Herod rounded up all the guards, interrogated them, and executed all 16. But it came around, and what happened to Herod is pretty gross. You want to hear? So after the debacle involving Peter, Herod decided to get a little rest and relaxation, so he went down to the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. And one day he decided to hold a rally. He got all dressed up in his royal attire, seated himself on a majestic throne, and gave a rousing speech. In fact, his words caused people to shout over and over, "He's a god, not a human," which Herod liked a lot. So you remember that angel that nudged Peter awake? It struck Herod. And interestingly, it's the same word, nudged and struck. But whereas Peter woke up and was set free, Herod fell over, was eaten by worms, and died. The text says not died and was eaten by worms. He was eaten by worms and then died. And I told you, it's gross. But back to Peter, still standing on the street by himself, he came to his senses and ran toward the house where church members were gathered, praying for his release. Peter stood at the outer gate, knocked, nervously watching behind his back, hoping someone would come quickly to get him off the street. So what a relief when Rhoda came outside. She was overcome with joy to see Peter and hear his voice, and she was so overcome, she forgot to let him in. Instead, she ran inside to tell everyone, "Peter's at the gate." But they didn't believe her. "You've lost your mind," they said. But she kept insisting, "Peter is outside." And someone said, "Well, maybe it's his guardian angel." While they sat around debating, Peter was still standing in the street, panicked, wondering what was taking so long and what was all that noise coming from inside the house. Because if he didn't get off the street, he'd soon be found. And the consequences, they'd be deadly. So when those in the house finally decided to come out and see for themselves, they too were overcome with joy. And Peter motioned, "Be quiet." And they all went inside, and Peter recounted everything that had happened to him and told them to tell James and the brothers and sisters, and then, quote, he left for another place. That's it. Those are the last words about Peter. He left for another place, the end. It's kind of anticlimactic. And very little is known about what happens to Peter after that. At some point, somehow, he showed up in Rome, but little is known about his time in Rome. We know that both Peter and Paul lived in the city at the same time as Emperor Nero. It's only from non-biblical sources that we know that Peter died about the same time as the Great Fire in Rome, in the year 64. And tradition says Nero blamed Christians living in the city for the fire, even though he probably said it himself to justify his cruelty. And tradition says that Peter was crucified, but on an upside-down cross. He didn't want to be killed in the same way as Jesus, because remember, he said at the very beginning, I'm not worthy of it. So Peter was crucified, but Paul was not, because Paul was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizens couldn't be crucified. So instead, Paul was beheaded. So at least that's the common story. There are actually 15 different versions of how they died. 4 different stories about Peter, 5 different stories about Paul, and 6 involving them dying together, but not together as in the same place, but on the same day and the same year. All of that is, maybe, doesn't it seem odd that Scripture would record graphically how King Herod was eaten by worms, but there's nothing about Peter or really any of the other disciples except Stephen, who was stoned to death? But of course, there are variants in the details that describe the death of Jesus, too. 4 different Gospels. But, details aside, at least we know that Peter died as a martyr to the Christian faith, right? Oddly, the Bible itself contains no word of it. But anyway, so, after 3 months with Peter, what's the point? What's the bottom line? Peter's an average guy, the fisherman, with whose aspiration was to take care of his family. Jesus saw something in him and invited Peter to follow him, even though Jesus might later have wished to change his mind. Peter was often a bitter disappointment. He didn't just make little mistakes, misjudging some situations where he should have known better. Among the many faults and failings we've already mentioned, perhaps his most egregious failure was the night the soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the garden. And Peter pulled out a sword and cut the ear off a soldier. Absolutely opposite reaction Jesus taught. And yet, even after all that, Jesus gave him a chance to make things right? With those 3 little questions, do you love me? And to which Jesus gave the same answer, care for my sheep. After all those times of falling short, Jesus believed Peter could start again. All those times of really, really just wanting to do the right thing and getting it so wrong. Oh, Peter. And yet, bottom line, Peter's a good role model. And what could be more reassuring for us? For those of us who really, we just want to do the right thing. We aspire to follow the teachings of Jesus. But we often fail as often as we succeed. But Peter shows we can begin again. Go back to, do you love me? Well, then, take care of my people. And look who Peter became. Peter didn't give up. And just as Jesus said, became the rock on which he built his church, the church to which we belong, because Peter stood up and defended our place within it. A church which often, like Peter, gets it wrong, so wrong. But Christianity isn't about achieving perfection. Can I get an amen? Christianity is not about achieving perfection. It's always an aspiration with a commitment to try again. Start over. So my question, do you aspire to do better. Forgive a little more often than we do, and slow down the anger a little more than we do, and practice a little more patience than is what we feel in the moment, and love just a little more. And do you want to be set free from what you have failed to do? Just don't give up.